Hello, my name is Eric Kars, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Convergence Data Classification Community Group. The topic for today is going to be the 8 steps to Teamcenter Classification. And the presenters will be Richard Turner, Eric Kars, and Nate Beasley. The setup today for the presentation is going to be a 20-minute presentation followed up by a 10-minute Q&A. And some of the key learning points we'll be covering today will be the 8 steps to prepare classification data, rules on data normalization, exporting PLM XML files to Teamcenter, and a demonstration of Teamcenter. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Richard Turner.
Eric, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to the Classification Community Group meeting. Just a quick introduction on Convergence Data. We are a Siemens PLM partner, PLM World Partner, which is now called Realize. We're a member of the advisory board, and we also run the Classification Community Group, which is today's meeting. Welcome, everyone. So a little background on Convergence Data Services. We've been in business for 18 years. We work in a variety of industries: aerospace, electronics, automotive, consumer goods, oil and gas. And we specialize in classifying parts and products. They could be purchase parts, MRO, design parts, service parts, products that you want to sell online. Many times customers engage us in the context of migrating to an ERP system or a new PLM system, an MBM, or a PIM system for e-commerce. Typically, they do this because they want to reuse parts more efficiently. They want to mitigate part proliferation. They want to sell more products online. They want better data analytics. So those are a lot of things that we support today. Today's presentation is going to be focused on these 8 steps. We call the 8 steps Teamcenter classification process. Step number 1, we start with a parts list. So when we engage with a customer, they prioritize the parts or products that they want to classify and enrich with attribute data. We take that list and we build a classification structure in our software called DFR, which is designed for retrieval. And that classification structure can consist of categories for mechanical parts, electrical parts, raw materials. Once those parts are classified, we start the data harvesting, which is typically the longest step in the process. And we will gather information based on, say, a manufacturer part number. We'll go to approved supplier websites to collect data on purchase parts. We'll also, for OEM parts or design parts, we can work from specifications and drawings to collect information on those parts and enter all that information into the DFR database. Once we've harvested all that data, then we can then normalize the data, especially the string attribute data. We'll create what Teamcenter calls LOV lists, which are the list of values that are allowed for a string value, and that helps us in the normalization process as well. And then we'll validate the data to make sure there's no errors in the data, so we'll run those checks. And we'll also run our policy manager to make sure there's going to be no issues with exporting the data to Teamcenter. And if there are issues, we'll fix those before we actually do that. And then lastly, once we pass all these validations, we're in a position to export the files to Teamcenter, which Nate will talk about a little later in the presentation. And we do that with our export manager. And then the last step is putting the data into Teamcenter, step 8. So this next slide is more of a data flow. When we're working with our customers, typically the information that they give us is coming from many different legacy data sources, each having their own levels of data quality, some worse than others. Sometimes customers may have an existing data model that they might want us to work, and we can migrate that, at least as a starting point. And all this information goes into DFR, as I previously noted. And we also have a data services team, which Eric will talk about in a few minutes, and they can help with the classifying and cleansing of this data. And all this is done in DFR. And once all this information is approved by ourselves and our customers, we can then put the information in the Teamcenter through an XML load process that Nate will talk about in a few minutes. So the next person to present is Eric Kars. He runs a lot of these data services projects for us. He manages our resources in India and works with our customers using DFR, and he'll talk about that process right now.
Thank you, Rich. As Rich mentioned, we work with a data services team. We've got a very large team based out of India that we work with. and they use a number of tools such as web sourcing, document sourcing, to harvest, classify, and normalize that data and load this data into DFR. The team consists of various engineering backgrounds such as mechanical and electrical engineers, and their goal is to get all of this data prepared into the DFR software, where we can then continue to take that to the next step with validations, as I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is a 13-step classification checklist, and this is what we like to use on our projects as we kick off a project with our data services team. There's a few important things to note here. This is an all-inclusive list, but I'll note a few of them just for the purposes of not getting into too much detail. The first item here would be we typically like to work out of a group of similar purchase parts, working by commodity groups. Helps us work a little more efficiently and productively. And then the next major step would be getting that structure, that data model and that structure loaded into DFR and then approved. The approval step is a big step. We want to make sure that we try to get that data model as good as it can get before we move forward with the data harvesting piece, so that we don't make a bunch of changes later down the road. The next big piece in this checklist that I'd like to mention would be the validations. Once we get the data harvested and we go through all these steps in the middle, we get to our validation step where we check for all the errors and getting that data prepared for putting this into another system such as Teamcenter. This is another snapshot of the checklist up in the top left, and then below here is, following that same process, it's our status report that I, as a project manager, really like to use this with our status meetings with the clients. We use this to follow that life cycle and go through each step until we reach the end here. You can see in this view there are some commodity groups tied to this status report to give you sort of an illustrative view of what that looks like. And this aligns with our data services framework. And another illustrative point here, this would be an example of a project where we were doing 50,000 parts. The point here to make is that we break these up into batches. In this example, we broke it up into about 4 batches, spanning a 7 or 8 month time period. And the focus again is to try to work in that batch style fashion to get those approved, work through, validated, and then moving on to the next one. Here we have a snapshot of our DFR module Smart Track. So this is within our DFR Design for Retrieval software. We use this to line up with our status report as much as we can. It's a way to track these deliverables and delivered parts into DFR. So the parts will go into the part source list, and they'll work their way through the life cycle here of validation all the way down to data servicing and verifying and normalizing, ultimately getting to that step of customer review, where we then have an opportunity to approve and reject those delivered parts. And here we have another shot of our DFR. It's actually the thick client, it's a classification manager. This is an example of a classification structure and how that would look in DFR. Some thing to highlight here would be that we use an industry standard data model to help avoid spending too much time trying to create your own data model. Our team goes through and uses the industry standards to make that more efficient, and then getting that approval process and going as well. Once the data model has been approved and we've harvested all the data, we then have that loaded into our DFR software, where we then do validations. And everything you see here in the highlighted pink cells, that would mean that that's a validation error and indicates to us that we need to make a correction based on the rules that we have in place, such as strings being in a numeric field, or field lengths, for example. And here is another module within DFR, the allowed values list, also known as an LOV. We use these here on the right-hand side. You can see the data that's been coming in from data services. Those would be exceptions to the process, and then on the left-hand side would be the approved LOV. And some things to consider here in terms of validation rules, where we don't want to exceed character limits. We We also don't want to have any numeric LOV list where we have a mixed unit of measure. These are all things that we try to catch prior to getting that data ready and prepared for Teamcenter, which Nate's going to get into a little bit more detail on that here, I believe, on the next slide. So
yeah, thank you, Eric. So now in Teamcenter, when you're looking at navigating the structure, you're going to be browsing through the data model, picking a category and narrowing that down, and then you'll be able to view the attributes as well as their properties and values specific to that category. So what we're going to do here is show you what browsing through the data model looks like in Teamcenter. So as you can see, we can browse through down to leaf classes, open those up, and then be able to view the attributes as well as their LOVs, or lists of values, and see the different ones on the attributes we have them for. As well as that, you can also filter for your searches. You can select different values and filter more and more, which is also known as a faceted search, until you get a smaller result set. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen there, next to the search button, it says 0 out of 110. But if you look on the left, there are 172 parts in this category. So we've effectively filtered our result set down. Another thing you can do is toggle units of measure in Teamcenter. With the correct data being provided, you can toggle between units of measure as well as even active units, which would be metric and imperial. And Teamcenter will do the conversions on the fly for you. Here you can see us toggling between different units of measure, inches to feet, different temperatures, and other units. And here you can see us switching over to metric, and it's doing all of these conversions for us. Now, with Teamcenter, going to it, we like to follow some normalization rules. These are things that are going to help smooth out your process of going from your legacy system to Teamcenter. And a couple examples of that would be with your LOVs, they need to be limited to 63 characters for your values. That's Teamcenter's maximum, and that's a restriction that you have to follow. Otherwise, your values will be truncated on import. Another big one we've hit before is required attribute values not being filled. If those are not filled, the part data will not make it into Teamcenter at all. It will be rejected. And here's another example going back to toggling between metric and imperial. When I was saying that you need to provide data, one example of this is scale and precision. The scale is the total amount of digits in your numeric value, and the precision is the number of digits after the decimal. You need to make sure that these account for metric and imperial lengths. So for example, an attribute with a value of 1 inch would need a scale and precision large enough to account for the decimal value of metric. And also with system conversion, sometimes on your categories, you might have different screws, for example, with different types of diameters. So maybe you have a numeric, and maybe in another, you have a string diameter value. So in these types of cases, you want to analyze your data and figure out if you need to split up your categories to avoid these conflicts. Now, through our experience with Teamcenter, we've started to create a Teamcenter export checklist. And these are, again, things that you would want going from your legacy system or DFR to Teamcenter that you would need to follow to make sure that you can actually get your data in. In this list, you can see numbers 2 and 3 I've already touched on. You need your required attribute values filled, and you also want to set a maximum policy on your LOV values. Through our experience, we have realized that Teamcenter error logs are not the most intuitive. So it's imperative that you try to get no errors in your data before importing to Teamcenter to make the process as smooth as possible. And one more note on the unit of measures. In DFR, we have a mapping system for our units of measure because you need to match to the Teamcenter unit of measure IDs exactly. Otherwise, you won't be able to toggle between metric and imperial. So you either need your data to have matching units of measure or have some sort of mapping system like we do in DFR that will get that data over to Teamcenter and effectively let you toggle. And one more note here with the file importing, when you're going to Teamcenter, there is a specific order that you need to follow. You would want to start with your allowed values list or in Teamcenter list of values. And then after that, you would import your attribute data, which is going to tie to the LOV list. And then after that, you would want to import the classification data, which is going to link to the attributes and thus the LOVs. And finally, you would import the item data, which would tie into all three previous imports. And now back to Rich.
Thank you, Nate. We try to present a lot of material in a short period of time, but we're going to be presenting more detail at the Realize Live conference next month. So please come and check us out. We'll have a booth. We'll be at booth 410. And we also have a presentation on, I think it's the Tuesday, June 11th, or Wednesday. I forget which day it is. We're presenting at 2:45 on basically the same topic, but we have more time to present. And we'll also be doing a live demo. And you can also come to our booth and talk to us as well. And if you can't make the Realize conference, you're welcome to go to our website and sign up for the community group so you can get invitations to meetings like these, and as well as you can check out our blogs. We have a blog section on our website that talks about things like on the right here, Teamcenter Classification Best Practices is an example of one of the blogs you'll find. So come check it out. And if you want to follow up after this call to ask specific questions, just send an email to info@convergencedata.com.
All right, at this time, I think we'd like to open it up for questions. And just a reminder, if you do have a question, please use the webinar to type in your question, and we will answer it in that fashion. Okay, do see one question. At what point should I start loading parts into Teamcenter?
I can take a stab at that one. One of the things that we recommend is not necessarily rushing moving the parts in the Teamcenter, and to make sure you've checked the work that you've done. Specifically, what are the use cases that you want to be able to achieve with this data that you're putting in the Teamcenter? Like, what type of search queries do you want to be able to run? And make sure all the information is in your data model so you can support those search queries. Or what types of reports or analytics are you expecting to get out of this data, and make sure that you can get those before you put in the Teamcenter. If you put the data in the Teamcenter and you find out you can't achieve all of these things and you have to iterate the data in Teamcenter, it's going to create a lot more work. So I recommend trying to do that testing outside of the system prior to loading into Teamcenter.
Okay. And I do have another question here. It looks like it was just entered. How long does a project take?
So I guess there's no real easy answer to that, because typically the number of parts dictates how long the project's going to take. I think Eric had an illustrative example of 50,000 parts. And, you know, from the very start of the project to the end, you can expect that's going to take, at least with us doing the work, about 6 months. With a customer that's never done classification, it may take a lot longer, especially if they're trying to create classification structures from scratch, or they have a limited number of people that can help them with the data harvesting. It can take a little longer, but the main time driver is going to be the number of parts that you want to classify and the condition of your data. Hopefully, you have manufacturer part numbers with your purchase parts. If you don't have those types of things, that's going to add to the length of the project.
All right, I do have another question here. How many parts should you have in a category?
As far as parts in a category, there is no limit to that.
And that's both DFR and Teamcenter. There's no limits to the number of parts you can have in a category.
All right, and I do have another question here. How many levels can you have in your structure?
Again, with DFR and Teamcenter, there's no limit to the number of levels in the structure.
I can add on to that one as well. There are industry structures. If you're using something like UNSPSC, typically that's a 4-level structure. And if you want to stick to 4 levels, then you might want to have a constraint on that. But then you're going to ask yourself, why, why is it that you need 4 levels? Is there something you're trying to accomplish? Like, is there a system limitation? If you're putting this data into a system that can only manage a very flat structure, like a 4-level structure, then you want to make sure you establish what that limit is up front in the project.
I am showing another question here. Where do customers typically go wrong in their efforts? I don't know if any further clarification on which piece of the project on that.
Well, I can think of a couple of things. One is, when they're starting the project and you look at standard purchase parts like fasteners, and they start by building a classification structure on their own and debating with their engineering team on what the category and attribute profile should be, that ends up taking a long time, especially when you have a large group and there are a lot of engineers that are involved. I highly recommend cutting that step of the process out and just using industry standard classifications so that you can avoid the debate and the long timeline it would take to get everyone to agree. So I think that's one area. I can think of several others, but just another note is, one is not every single part is a candidate for classification. So I recommend you have a criteria that your management and executives want you to use on what parts should be classified and which ones should not be classified. And one thing to consider is how active is that part. If you order that part in the last, say, 2 years, then you probably want to run that part through classification. If it's a part that's obsolete, you probably don't want to run it through classification. Or if you haven't ordered that part, and it's been over 2 years, then you might not want to run it through classification. So that's another important thing to not make that mistake.
All right, looks like that answered the question, and I'm not seeing any further questions at this time.
All right.
All right. So I think with that, we can close out the webinar session. And like Rich said, this will be available. This webinar session will be available for those who attended and those who did not. So,
yeah.
All right.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank you,
for
everybody.
attending.